The December wind cut through Manhattan like 1,000 tiny knives, but Marcus Chen didn't feel it anymore. He sat on the weathered wooden bench in Madison Square Park, his $1,000 coat doing nothing to warm the coldness that had settled in his chest 3 years ago. The title on his business card read CEO of Chen Industries. But tonight, on this New Year's Eve, he was just another shadow among the city lights. His phone buzzed with invitations to galas and parties from people who wanted his money, his connections, his power, but none of them wanted him. The real him. The broken man who had buried his daughter Emma on another winter night, who had watched his wife Sarah walk away 6 months later because looking at him reminded her too much of what they had lost. He pulled out the small pink hair ribbon from his wallet, the one Emma used to wear every Sunday to church, and let his fingers trace its worn edges. She would have been 9 today, would have been wearing her favorite purple dress, would have been excited about staying up until midnight. For the first time, would have been alive if he hadn't been in that board meeting, if he had picked her up from school himself instead of sending the driver, if the drunk driver had taken a different route, if. The thoughts circled like vultures, picking at the corpse of his happiness. The park was mostly empty now, just a few couples hurrying through to their warm celebrations, their laughter floating on the cold air like mockery. Marcus had chosen this bench specifically because it faced away from the playground. He couldn't bear to see the empty swings, the silent slides, the joy of other people's children. He had sat here every New Year's Eve since Emma died, marking the passage of time not in achievements or milestones, but in the deepening of his solitude. His company had tripled in value since then. He had been featured on magazine covers, had given speeches at conferences about success and leadership, but it all felt like playing a character in someone else's story. The real Marcus had died in that hospital room, holding his daughter's still warm hand, whispering promises he couldn't keep about how everything would be okay. He noticed the church bells starting their early evening chime, 9 o'clock, 3 hours until the world celebrated new beginnings, while he remained frozen in his ending. That's when he heard the small voice, like a bell of its own, bright and impossible to ignore. "Mister, why are you crying?" Marcus looked down to find a little girl, maybe 6 years old, wearing a coat that had seen better days, and boots that didn't match. Her face was round and earnest, her dark eyes filled with the kind of concern that only children can show to complete strangers. Marcus quickly wiped his face, not realizing he had been crying. "I'm not crying," he said automatically, the lie coming easily after 3 years of practice. "Sometimes my eyes just water in the cold." The little girl studied him with the intensity of a detective, then shook her head. "My mama says it's okay to cry. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. She cries because she misses my papa who went to heaven. Do you miss someone in heaven too?" The directness of the question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Before he could form a response, another voice called out, "Rosie! Rosie, where did you go?" A woman appeared from behind the fountain, her face flushed from running, her worn coat flying open to reveal a waitress uniform underneath. She looked tired in the way that single mothers do, the kind of tired that goes bone deep but never shows in front of their children. "I'm sorry," she said breathlessly to Marcus, grabbing Rosie's hand. "She just ran off. We're heading to the shelter for their New Year's dinner, and she saw you sitting here, and ... She trailed off, really looking at him for the first time, taking in his expensive clothes, his hollow eyes, the pink ribbon he was still clutching. "It's fine," Marcus managed to say. "She's just being kind." The woman, whose name tag read Diana, seemed to hesitate. Rosie tugged on her mother's coat. "Mama, he's sad, like you get sometimes. Can he come to dinner with us? Sister Mary says nobody should eat alone on special days." Diana's face colored with embarrassment. "Rosie, honey, I'm sure this gentleman has plans." She looked at Marcus, apologetically. "I'm so sorry. She doesn't understand that not everyone ... She paused, searching for words that wouldn't offend. That people have different lives, she finished lamely. Marcus looked at the little girl, at her earnest face, and her mismatched boots. At her mother, trying to maintain dignity, despite their obvious struggles, and something shifted in his chest. It wasn't healing, not exactly, but it was movement. In a heart that had been still for so long. Actually, he heard himself saying, I don't have plans. I was just sitting here, waiting for midnight alone. Rosie's face lit up like someone had plugged in Christmas lights behind her eyes. Then you can come with us. Sister Mary makes the best soup, and there's bread that's still warm, and sometimes there's even cake, and nobody has to eat alone. Diana looked mortified. Sir, you don't have to. I mean, it's a homeless shelter. It's not. She gestured vaguely at his obvious wealth. It's for people who need. Maybe I need, Marcus said quietly, surprising himself with the honesty. Maybe I need more than you know. Diana studied him for a long moment, something passing between them, an understanding that transcends social boundaries. She had lost someone too. He could see it in the way she held herself, protective and fragile at the same time. Okay, she said finally. Okay, but you should know. It's not fancy. It's just a room full of people, trying to make the best of things. Marcus stood up, his legs stiffed from sitting so long in the cold. That sounds perfect, actually. As they walked through the park, Rosie chattered non-stop about everything and nothing. About her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who had a cat named Whiskers. About the snowman she wanted to build if it snowed more. About how her papa used to tell her stories about brave princesses who saved kingdoms. Marcus found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in years. Diana walked quietly beside them, occasionally shooting him curious glances. When they reached the shelter, a converted church basement with steam-fogged windows, and the sound of many voices inside, Marcus hesitated at the door. The last time he had been in a church was Emma's funeral. Diana seemed to sense his reluctance. You don't have to come in, she said gently. We just thought. Rosie thought you might want company. But Rosie had already grabbed his hand with her small one. And the touch was so reminiscent of Emma that Marcus felt his heart crack open just a little more. Inside, the shelter was exactly as Diana had described. Nothing fancy, but full of something Marcus had forgotten existed. Genuine. Human warmth. Long tables were set with mismatched plates and cups. Volunteers ladled soup from huge pots, and the air was thick with the smell of bread and the sound of conversation. Nobody looked at Marcus's expensive coat with envy or calculation. They were all too busy with their own struggles, their own small celebrations. Sister Mary, a woman who looked like she could be anyone's grandmother, greeted them with a smile that suggested she had been expecting them, even Marcus. Welcome, she said simply, as if millionaire CEOs showed up at her shelter every day. There's always room for one more. They found seats at a table with an elderly man named George, who told stories about his days as a jazz musician, a young mother named Tasha, who was juggling twin toddlers, and a teenager named Alex, who was there alone but trying to look like he didn't care. Rosie introduced Marcus to everyone as my friend, who was sad but isn't alone anymore, and somehow, that became his identity for the evening. Not CEO, not widower, not broken father. Just a friend who had been sad. The soup was simple, vegetable, and barley, but it was hot and filling in a way that the five-star meals Marcus usually ate never were. Rosie sat next to him, occasionally patting his arm as if to make sure he was still there, still okay. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself talking to Diana about safer topics at first. The challenge of finding good schools, the way the city changed with the seasons. But gradually, their conversation deepened. She told him about her husband, Carlos, who had been a construction worker, how he had fallen from scaffolding 2 years ago, how she had been trying to keep their heads above water ever since. The hardest part, she said quietly, while Rosie was getting seconds of bread, is trying to be both parents, trying to be enough. Carlos was the fun one, the one who made her laugh. I'm just trying to keep us fed and sheltered. Marcus understood that feeling, the weight of being insufficient. My daughter Emma, he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so long. She loved to paint. Every wall in our house was covered with her art. After she died, my wife wanted to paint over them, said it hurt too much to see them. We fought about it. We fought about everything, really, because it was easier than talking about the fact that she was gone. Diana reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. I'm so sorry. It was a simple gesture, but it was the first time in 3 years that someone had touched him with genuine compassion rather than professional courtesy or social obligation. At 11:30, Sister Mary stood up and tapped a spoon against a glass. Friends, she said, her voice carrying, despite its softness. We have a tradition here. Before midnight, anyone who wants to can share something they're grateful for from this year, no matter how small. And anyone who wants to can share a hope for the new year. No pressure, just possibility. One by one, people stood up. George was grateful for his new hearing aid that let him hear music again. Tasha was grateful her twins were healthy. Alex, the teenager who had been trying to look tough, stood up and said quietly that he was grateful for places like this where nobody asked too many questions. When it was Diana's turn, she stood and said, I'm grateful that my daughter still believes in kindness, that she hasn't let our struggles make her hard, and I hope that next year I can give her more than just survival. Rosie popped up next. I'm grateful for my mama, and for soup, and for new friends, she said, looking directly at Marcus. And I hope that next year nobody has to be sad alone. The room went quiet, and Marcus realized people were waiting to see if he would speak. He hadn't planned to, but Rosie's expectant face made him slowly stand. His voice was rusty from disuse, from 3 years of giving only professional presentations, rather than speaking from the heart. I'm grateful, he began, then had to stop and clear his throat. I'm grateful that a little girl in mismatched boots reminded me that kindness doesn't care about bank accounts, that sometimes the richest people are the poorest in what matters. I'm grateful for this soup, this table, these stories, for being reminded that grief shared is somehow lighter than grief carried alone. He paused, looking at Diana and Rosie. And I hope that next year I can be the kind of person who deserves the invitation I received tonight. He sat down quickly, his face hot, but the applause that followed was warm and genuine. Rosie hugged his arm, and Diana smiled at him with tears in her eyes. As midnight approached, they all went outside to watch the fireworks that would be visible over the buildings. Rosie stood between Marcus and Diana, holding both their hands, her face turned up to the sky in wonder. When the first burst of color exploded overhead, she squeezed Marcus's hand. Mr. Marcus, she said, yeah, you can be in our family, if you want. We're small, but we're good at loving people. Marcus felt something break inside him, but for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't breaking in the way that brings collapse. It was breaking like ice in spring, like walls that have stood too long, like the shell of a seed that's ready to grow. He looked at Diana, who was watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. I don't want to complicate your lives, he said quietly. You have enough challenges without taking on someone else's grief. Diana turned to him, and in the light of the fireworks, he could see the strength that had kept her going through her own loss. Maybe, she said, maybe it's not about taking on grief. Maybe it's about sharing the load. Maybe it's about teaching my daughter that families can look different, can form in unexpected ways. Maybe it's about accepting that help can come from unexpected places. She paused, then added with a small smile, besides, you look like you could use some practice at being part of something again. Marcus thought about his empty penthouse, his silent office, his life that looked successful from the outside, but felt like a mausoleum on the inside. Then he looked at Rosie, still gazing at the fireworks with pure joy, and Diana, offering him not pity, but partnership in the messy business of healing. Okay, he said, the word feeling like the first step on a new path. Okay, I'd like that. Over. The next few months, Marcus became a regular part of their lives in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. He started having dinner with them twice a week. Simple meals in Diana's small apartment, where Rosie would show him her homework and her drawings. He learned that she loved butterflies and dinosaurs equally, that she was afraid of thunder, but brave about needles, that she had her father's laugh and her mother's determination. He helped Diana find a better job at one of his company's subsidiaries. Not as charity, but because she was genuinely qualified and had been overlooked by everyone else. He set up a trust fund for Rosie's education, but more importantly, he showed up for her school plays and soccer games, things that money couldn't buy. Diana helped him too, though she might not have realized it at first. She made him laugh again with her dry observations about life. She challenged him when he tried to solve everything with his checkbook instead of his presence. She shared her own grief in ways that made his feel less isolating, less like a personal failure and more like a human experience. The three of them didn't fit any conventional model of family. Marcus still had his penthouse, Diana and Rosie still had their apartment, but increasingly they occupied a shared emotional space that transcended physical addresses. Marcus taught Rosie to play chess, Diana taught Marcus to cook simple meals, and Rosie taught them both that healing could happen in moments of ordinary joy, not just in grand gestures or therapy sessions. There were setbacks, of course. The first time Rosie called him Dad by accident, Marcus had to leave the room, overwhelmed by grief and guilt and something that might have been hope. Diana had her own moments of panic, wondering if she was being foolish to trust again, to let someone into their carefully constructed world of two. But they kept showing up for each other, kept choosing to be present, even when it was hard. On Emma's birthday, Marcus took Diana and Rosie to the cemetery for the first time. Rosie left a drawing she had made of butterflies and dinosaurs playing together, because your Emma might like both things too. Diana stood quietly beside him, not trying to fill the silence with platitudes, just being present while he grieved. Afterwards, they went for ice cream, because Rosie insisted that birthdays should have ice cream, even if the person was in heaven. And somehow that made more sense than any of the grief counseling Marcus had tried. By the next New Year's Eve, everything had changed. They were back at the shelter, but this time Marcus was there as a volunteer, ladling soup while Diana helped with dessert, and Rosie entertained the younger children with stories. The same bench where he had sat alone was now where the three of them had picnics in warmer weather. The pink ribbon was still in his wallet, but now it shared space with a photo of Rosie at her school play, dressed as a butterfly dinosaur hybrid of her own design. When Sister Mary asked for gratitudes that night, Marcus stood without hesitation. Last year, he said, a little girl taught me that family isn't about blood, or tradition, or even shared history. It's about choosing to show up for each other, choosing to see past the surface, to the need underneath, choosing love even when you're scared of losing again. I'm grateful for second chances, for families that form in unlikely places, for the courage of a 6-year-old who saw a sad man on a bench and decided he needed to be included. He looked at Diana, who was now wearing an engagement ring he had given her, not in some elaborate proposal but during a quiet moment in her kitchen, with Rosie's enthusiastic pre-approval. I'm grateful that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, that sometimes it shows up in a worn coat and mismatched boots, offering nothing but soup and companionship and the radical idea that nobody should be alone. The room erupted in applause, but Marcus only had eyes for his new family. Rosie ran to him and jumped into his arms, and he held her tight. This little girl, who had saved him not by replacing Emma, but by showing him that his heart was big enough to hold both grief and new love, memory and possibility. Diana joined them, her arms wrapping around both of them, and in that embrace, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years, wholeness, not the absence of grief, but the presence of something stronger. Later, as they walked home together through the snowy streets, Rosie between them holding both their hands, she looked up at Marcus. "Mr. Marcus?" she said. "Yeah, sweetheart. I know I'm not Emma, and that makes you sad sometimes. But Mama says that hearts are like houses. They can have lots of rooms. So maybe Emma has one room, and I have another room, and we can both be in your heart house. Is that okay?" Marcus stopped walking, knelt down in the snow, despite his expensive pants, and hugged Rosie tight. "That's more than okay," he said, his voice thick with tears. "That's perfect. That's exactly how hearts work." Diana knelt beside them, and they stayed there for a moment. Three people who had found each other in loss and chosen to build something new from the pieces. As they finally stood and continued walking, Marcus thought about the title of his story, the one he would never write in a business book but would carry in his heart forever. "You can be in our family if you want," said the little girl to the lonely CEO, sitting on the bench. It wasn't a story about corporate success or strategic planning. It was a story about the unexpected places we find redemption, the surprising faces of angels, and the truth that sometimes the smallest hands can pull us from the deepest darkness. It was a story about how family isn't always about who we're born to, but who finds us when we're lost, who sees us when we're invisible, who offers us belonging when we've forgotten we're worthy of it. And it was a story that was still being written, one ordinary day at a time, one shared meal at a time, one chosen moment of love at a time. 5 years later, Marcus stood in a different church, watching Rosie, now 11, walk down the aisle as a flower girl in another wedding, one of Diana's friends from the shelter, who had also found love in an unexpected place. Their son, Carlos Jr., just 2 years old, toddled beside her, throwing petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Diana sat in the front row, her hand in Marcus's, her wedding ring catching the light from the stained glass windows. The shelter had become their second home, but not out of need anymore. They had founded the EMA and Carlos Foundation, providing not just food and shelter, but counseling, job training, and most importantly, community for those who had lost their way. The bench in Madison Square Park now had a small plaque that read, "Sometimes angels wear mismatched boots." Only 3 people knew what it meant, but that was enough. After the ceremony, as they all sat together at the reception, Rosie stood to make a toast. She had insisted on preparing herself. "Some people think families are just about who looks like who, or who was born to who," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I know better. Families are about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love even when it's scary. My dad Marcus taught me that money can't buy happiness, but it can buy soup for people who need it. My mom taught me that being strong doesn't mean not crying. It means crying and keeping going anyway. And my brother Emma, who I never met but who I know is watching, taught all of us that love doesn't end just because someone goes to heaven." She raised her glass of apple juice. "So here's 2 families that don't match, 2 love that doesn't quit, and 2 little girls who aren't afraid to talk to sad men on benches." The room laughed and cried in equal measure. Marcus pulled his family close, Diana on one side, Rosie on the other, Carlos Jr. on his lap, and felt Emma's presence like a warm wind, blessing this strange and beautiful life he never could have imagined when he sat alone on that cold bench, convinced his story was over. But stories, he had learned, were like families. They could surprise you, reshape themselves, find new chapters in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, a little girl in a worn coat would write you into hers, and you would discover that the end of one story was just the beginning of another. That night, as they tucked Rosie and Carlos Jr. into bed, Rosie asked the question she asked every New Year's Eve. "Tell me again about the night we met." And Marcus would tell her, adding new details each time, about how cold it was, about how her boots were one purple and one green, about how her voice sounded like bells in the winter air. Diana would add her parts, about how scared she was that he would be offended, about how his eyes looked so lost, about how she knew somehow that they were meant to help each other. And Rosie would smile, satisfied, and say what she always said, "I knew you belonged with us. I could tell because you had the same lonely that Mama had, and I figured if we put two lonelies together, they might make a happy." And she was right. Two lonelies, brought together by a child's innocent invitation, had indeed made not just a happy, but a whole life, a whole family, a whole new story worth living. The title echoed in Marcus's mind as he stood in the doorway, watching his children sleep. "You can be in our family if you want," said the little girl to the lonely CEO sitting on the bench. It had become more than a memory. It had become a promise, a theology, a way of moving through the world with an open heart, despite the risk, because of the possibility, in defiance of the odds. And in the quiet of their home, with snow beginning to fall outside, and his family safe and sleeping, Marcus whispered a thank you to Emma for sending him an angel in mismatched boots, to Carlos for trusting him with his girls, to Diana for seeing past his broken pieces, and to Rosie for having the courage to offer belonging to a stranger. Because sometimes the greatest gifts come in the smallest packages, the most profound wisdom comes from the youngest voices, and the strongest families are built not from perfection but from the beautiful mess of choosing each other again and again, one day at a time, one season at a time, one "you can be in our family if you want" at a time.